Hi there and good evening and welcome to the Jim Bohannon Show from Westwood One Radio. We're at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. Online, find us at jimbohannonshow.com, and you can follow me on Twitter at Jimbo Talks. The president is attempting to make peace in the area of our longest conflict ever. Here's what the president's had to say.
We had good meetings with the Taliban, and we are going to be leaving, and we're going to be bringing our soldiers back home. We've been there for almost 20 years. It's a long time. We've done a great job in terms of getting rid of terrorists. Now it's up to other countries to get rid of those terrorists. We have discussions to go, but we've made a lot of progress.
Those are the remarks of the president. This, of course, comes in the face of what is, at the moment now, a yeah, but from the Taliban. Yeah, but first free all of our prisoners, some 5,000 Taliban prisoners currently being held. Whether that proves to be something that undoes the deal, or whether or not we are that committed to leaving regardless, well, we can talk a bit about that tonight, and we'll do so with your calls at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626, and with Colonel Daniel Davis, retired from the U.S. Army after 21 years of active service, and serves as a defense fellow and military expert for defensepriorities.org. He was deployed into combat zones 4 times in his career, beginning with Operation Desert Storm in 91, Iraq in 09, Afghanistan twice in 05 and 2011. Colonel, good evening.
Good evening. Good to be here.
Good to have you on tonight. It occurs to me that if you go back to the days of Vietnam, the North Vietnamese, at the time the North Vietnamese, signed the Paris Peace Accords, and there were promises that, we'll leave, but you've got to behave. And, of course, they didn't waste very long in not behaving and attacking whole hog with conventional forces southward, and we launched a few airstrikes, and that was it. And they guessed quite correctly that was going to be it. And my guess is that the Taliban has guessed quite correctly that they can do pretty much what they want to, and aside from us raising our voice and maybe launching a couple of cruise missiles, that's about it. That would be my take, and I'm wondering your thoughts.
Well, they actually are at a much bigger disadvantage than it may appear. The reason we've been unable to vanquish them militarily is because they've existed in the shadows, and it's impossible to know from day to day, or even from hour to hour sometimes, which one is the Taliban and which one is just some innocent farmer. And their ability to shift back and forth without being noticed has been what's kept them in power all this time, because that even takes impact, or that's even in the case for the Afghan military. But the minute that they exist out in the open, like an actual army, which would be necessary to actually capture Kabul, for example, then they become extremely vulnerable, just like they were in October 2001. When they existed as an open army, we were easily able to just wipe them out, because that's where our military strength comes in, is to being able to take out armies. So they actually don't have quite the much freedom that a lot of people think they do, which is one of the reasons why I've been so outspoken in saying that we need to withdraw our forces on our terms, on our time schedule, in a professional way. And so then that the Afghan people and the Taliban, they have to then come to some kind of an agreement that both can live with, because the Taliban can't just dominate the way they did before, because, we're still going to be able to help them out. And the Afghans now have a big army they didn't have before.
Well, I'll put it this way. Certainly that we will have that capability if we have the will to use it. Yes, I certainly think your assessment is right on target. I am not at all that certain that we would. For example, just to contemplate for the moment what for me is a not very pleasant possibility, but let's assume that come January 20th that we have President Bernard Sanders in office. Do you think he would use the military like that?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're right. That's an unknown quantity. What we know is President Trump seems very, very outspoken about what he's willing to do right now. And he said, we're not going to abandon, we're not going to leave. But as we know, when you get into a new administration, all bets are off. And so that's a fair statement.
Yeah. In any event, suffice it to say that should they try for a major land grab, Afghanistan is admittedly a large country. It, of course, has a lot of rocky terrain, but I suppose most of the population centers would require some access, shall we say, out in the open, as it were. You don't have certainly a lot of rainforests, for example. As long as you can hide in mountain passes and the like, as the Russians found out, that's pretty effective. But of course, that involved purely guerrilla forces, large masked forces, if you will, armies, as it were. That would be a convenient target, assuming that we chose to do so. And I'm sure that a lot of people will throw up the alternative, which is okay. Even if that is what you said, Bohannon, is true, even if that comes to pass, are we supposed to stay there forever? And I suppose that's really the central question that we have.
Right.
Presumably, there are places in the world, I don't know, maybe Canada, where we would be prepared to fight forever. I'm not sure exactly where all those places are. I'm not even sure that we'd be prepared to fight forever for every single piece of NATO, quite honestly, but maybe I'm a cynic.
No, I think there's some validity to that.
So we are, in other words, recognizing not just military limitations, but we're recognizing limitations of will. Quite frankly, we don't wanna, and that I suppose is sufficient. I'm afraid that sends a kind of an unfortunate message to a number of forces in this world, which, of course, is the message that goes back to Vietnam. And that is that if you're going to fight with Uncle Sam, if you can survive the first few rounds, Uncle Sam will get tired, and Sam will get tired of fighting. And so you can last into the later rounds, and you have a good chance at winning. That is a truth that bothers me somewhat.
Well, I think that the bigger truth that I don't think anybody around the world is very confused about. When something is definitely in our national interest, there is no price we won't pay. There is no amount of force we won't use. When something is not in our interest, and when it becomes clear that we should not have been in Afghanistan, we should not have stayed in Afghanistan after the initial military operations were won, then we shouldn't have gone to, as Bush first did, to nation building, and then Obama even deepened it further. That was the strategic, catastrophic mistake that we made. We should never have done, because that locked us into something that's not in our interest. And so, unless we're willing to wipe out the population, as President Trump mentioned a time or two, you can't win that militarily. So we put ourselves in a position that we could not succeed. It was impossible. Now we need to rectify that by saying, all right, we're going to withdraw ourselves from something that can be won, and we'll still be engaged diplomatically and economically. We'll still want to help. But ultimately, the Afghan people have to make this work one way or the other.
Well, I'm sure that they will make it work one way or the other, and my guess is that however it is accomplished, that it'll work one way or another, not through a coalition government, to which I think the Taliban is congenitally incapable of being a part of. I think it'll work because they will eventually come to dominate, even if it's through some charade of play pretend democracy. I just fail to think that a revolutionary movement like that, with extreme ideological values, is going to say, okay, well, we'd like 3 cabinet positions, pretty please. That to me, that's a stretch.
Yeah, they're definitely not going to be saying pretty please, and that's one of the big I guess points that I'm trying to make, anyone who will listen right now, is that the Taliban is unequivocally in the dominant position militarily on the ground in Afghanistan. And the idea that the Ghani government is going to come in and be able to make all these demands and include all this other stuff and say they have to meet all this, that's just not going to happen, because the Taliban don't have to agree to any of it until the Allied side is willing to make some significant concessions. Then there's not going to even be the possibility, and they'll keep fighting. But there are some advantages that the Afghan government has, and that the Taliban is also really tired from fighting all this time. And they have said of their own initiative that they're not actually trying to completely dominate the place anymore, because they realized that they didn't even finish that in 1996. It's important to point out. They were still in a fight with the Northern Alliance when we intervened. And so they already knew they couldn't succeed in the past, and then they definitely see that they lost what power they had because they backed Al-Qaeda. Now then, they're not going to create that problem again, but there's some evidence that if they can get some ability to govern in their areas, in the Pashtun areas, that they don't necessarily want to go and govern all of Afghanistan because they want the Tajiks to go their area and the Hazaras and all these other groups in their area, especially in the north. So there is some room to have a federated situation that actually has possibilities.
More to come. 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. Retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis is our guest. He's a senior fellow and military expert for defense priorities. We're examining the process toward a peace deal with the Taliban, one where there is a momentary hang-up, but I don't think anyone doubts that by some means or another that we will go along with that. Maybe there'll be a partial prisoner release. Who knows? 1-866-50-JIMBO is our number, 1-866-505-4626, and we'll be back on the Jim Bohannon Show in just a moment. Our guest in this portion of the program, again, is Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, retired of the U.S. Army. We're taking a look at the proposed deal with the Taliban. As we go to some calls here, first of all, let me just ask you this. Do I really care that much that Afghanistan is not going to be a Jeffersonian republic? And I'm wondering if it would take, in your view, Colonel Davis, another 9/11 style attack for us to say, oh, okay, that's too much.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. That's not going to happen. And that's one of the things that's most important for people to understand right now. The original 9/11 didn't happen because Afghanistan existed, because people were on the ground in Afghanistan. Most of the planning for Afghanistan happened in Sudan. It happened in Pakistan. The planning was done in Germany. It was done in Florida and in Maryland. Most of it was done outside of it. The only reason Afghan was in play at all is because bin Laden had just repositioned from Sudan into Afghanistan, which is where the conversations took place. They could have happened anywhere else in the world. And we could have taken out bin Laden before that. There were, according to the 9/11 Commission report, 9 separate cases where we had the ability to take him out, but politically, Clinton and several others chose not to do so. We have now refined that to an extremely high degree, as we've seen when we took out bin Laden in 2011 with al-Baghdadi, with the leader of the al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, we just took out just a few weeks ago, and it's several others, and with Soleimani also in Iran. If we find a direct threat to the United States, we have the ability to project power without having troops on the ground in any of those places.
Very true.
That's why we can keep us straight. So, but the other point that's important, especially with the Taliban, they're battling ISIS right now because they are ideological in opposition in how they view the Islamic culture or the codes, and they actually fight each other right now. So that's the idea that they're going to somehow join together is very unlikely because the Taliban is a local organization, not an international one. Yeah, I mean, a loya jirga is something that has historically the Afghans use to have a council and a committee where they have lots of representatives of different factions, and they come together and they resolve complicated issues. That's actually part of how they got to the original constitution here, and something that many people say can be used to bring peace right now and to include the Taliban to come to some kind of an agreement to where they can have peace.
And you think that is a concept that the Taliban would be prepared to go along with? Let's say that such a gathering of ideas, such a consensus building, if you will, not that dissimilar, I suppose, in its own way to what the founders did in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. Let's say that it included something less than stringent enforcement of all the Islamic rules on painted fingernails and growing beards by men and so forth, and the Taliban would just say, oh, okay. I mean, again, as I said, they'll go the direction that they'll go. If they're not a threat to us, I can live with that, but I also don't buy into that notion that may be...
And I think it's important to point out that we absolutely, and in anything that I advocate, we don't trust the Taliban for anything. I mean, absolutely nothing, that they'll do anything they say. If they make an agreement, it's terrific. That'd be great if they did. But I trust nothing they do, and our security is dependent on our military and our capabilities and intelligence services to be able to prevent anything from hitting the United States. So we don't have to trust the Taliban. If they want to work within their own country and they, don't keep their agreements, well, then they've got to answer to their fellow countrymen who also have weapons, and that's something that can handle inside their borders. But that's not something that we need to hold them to. That's something that they've got to figure out.
All right. Now then, you mentioned all the various tribes, and certainly tribalism and opposition to modernity is a large part of what fuels movements like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And I'll just ask you this. It can be argued that Iraq is not a viable nation state, that Syria may not any longer be a viable nation state if it ever was. Nigeria is not a viable nation state. Somalia is not a viable nation state. Is Afghanistan a viable nation state?
If we allow them to try to figure it out on their own, then it's possible. And I'll only say possible. But if we try to make them stick with like the sort of constitution that the Obama administration forced onto them in 2014 to accommodate their corrupt presidential election at that time, then no, it's not going to work. It's going to fail it's going to stumble along until we finally pull our support out. That's exactly what happened to the Soviets. But if we allow them on their own to come up with their own through a Lois Jirga or whatever other means, then it's possible.
Fair enough. All right. Very good, Colonel Davis. We thank you very much for joining us tonight.